Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, honestly kind of wild intersection where your everyday domestic wallet collides head-on with high-stakes global strategy. We are drawing from a recent deep dive analysis by the panel on MS Now, and they unpacked a pretty tense situation playing out on the world stage right now. They looked at how having a completely singular foreign policy goal can send massive economic aftershocks right back here to our own backyards, and exactly how our biggest global competitors are reading this moment. It is a brilliant look at how the microeconomics of, say, your grocery bill are completely tied to the macro geopolitics of the entire globe. Okay, let's dive right into this. The entire analysis basically hinges on this incredibly provocative quote from the president. As the MSNO panel pointed out, this statement perfectly sets up the core tension we're looking at today. On one side, you've got an administration intensely, almost exclusively, focused on a singular foreign policy objective, preventing a nuclear Iran. But on the other side, well, you have the everyday American consumer. And the panel highlighted that openly stating you don't think about the financial situation at all is a remarkably blunt admission of where the policy priorities actually lie. So that begs the big question, right? What actually happens when foreign policy and domestic wallets completely collide? I mean, it's one thing to have a geopolitical objective halfway across the world. It's another entirely when the strategy to pull that off starts creating a severe ripple effect on the home front. We're going to explore exactly how the experts trace this ripple effect, literally moving from the war room to the gas pump and ultimately to the negotiating tables in Beijing. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. A controversial policy focus. 2. The domestic economic reality. 3. The China-Iran connection. And 4. China's geopolitical long game. All right, starting off with Section 1, a controversial policy focus, specifically looking at the messaging disconnect. You know, when policies cause pain at home, communication is absolutely crucial. But the MSN Now reporting revealed a pretty stark contrast here. Behind closed doors, staffers are apparently practically begging the president to adopt economic messaging, to just show some empathy for the financial strain Americans are dealing with. But publicly, the messaging remains this singular, unyielding focus on Iran that completely ignores or even flat out dismisses the domestic financial impact. And the panel didn't just speak in abstracts here. They brought the receipts, providing specific examples of what they called tone-deaf messaging. For instance, National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett actually claimed that Americans racking up record credit card debt is a good sign. Then you have the president himself dismissing soaring gas prices as just a mere blip. And finally, figures like Pete Hegseth and various lawmakers have openly argued that Americans are perfectly okay with this bargain, basically saying we are supposedly perfectly willing to accept higher living costs in exchange for the promise of a safer non-nuclear Iran. But are people actually okay with it? Let's move to Section 2, the domestic economic reality, or, as we can probably all relate to, wallet shock. Because when the panel shifted their focus from political spin to hard economic data, it totally contradicted the idea of a mere blip. Take the number 17.9%. According to the data discussed by the panel, energy costs have surged by nearly 18%. That is absolutely not a minor fluctuation. That is a massive spike that consumers feel in their gut every single time they fill up their gas tanks or pay a utility bill. And naturally, that feeds right into this next figure, 3.8% inflation. The panel noted this is the absolute worst inflation rate we've seen since May of 2023. Now, importantly, they also did a quick fact check on a claim made by the president who stated pre-war inflation was only 1.7%. Actually, the panel impartially clarified that the true pre-war figure was 2.4%. So the economic trajectory was already facing some pretty stiff headwinds before the current conflict just dumped gasoline on the fire. To try and combat this intense pressure at the pump, the administration proposed pausing the federal gas tax, which sits at exactly 18.4 cents per gallon. The panel analyzed this move, and they pointed out that, sure, it's an attempt to artificially lower gas prices ahead of elections, but it comes with some really severe implications for things like highway funding, which, you guessed it, relies entirely on that specific tax revenue. But here's the real kicker the panel emphasized. This isn't just about driving. The economic shock extends so far beyond just gas. The overwhelming majority of economists are warning of huge global aftershocks. The cost of energy impacts the cost of fertilizer, which in turn impacts the cost of everyday consumer goods. Literally, the tomatoes in your supermarket are getting more expensive. This geopolitical conflict is quite literally sitting right there on your dinner table. Moving right along to Section 3, the China-Iran connection and the strategy abroad. So, to ease this massive domestic economic pain, the U.S. is executing a major pivot. we are turning to our greatest geopolitical rival for help. But why China? Well, the panel argued that previous disruptive policies have left the U.S. pretty isolated. They brought up incidents like the whole Greenland fiasco that pushed away European allies, and trade tariffs that alienated goodwill abroad, while totally disrupting domestic sectors like soybean farming. The result? According to the MSN Now analysts, the U.S. president is now traveling to Beijing, quote, hat in hand, desperately needing them to open markets and provide investment. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly complex geopolitical chess move the administration is attempting to pull off. Step 1, go to China. Step 2, extract real economic concessions or investments from them. Step 3, use that new leverage to get China to lean heavily on Iran. And Step 4, Iran magically agrees to open the Straits of Hormuz, stabilizing global energy markets. I mean, it is a massive high-wire act, relying almost entirely on the cooperation of a major rival. But let's be real. Even if China decides to play ball and help out, the MS Now panel pointed out the stark nuclear reality on the ground is messy. Currently, there is only a very fragile ceasefire in place. Iran still retains its nuclear capabilities. On top of that, Iran continually rejects deals that merely put a 20-year stall on their enrichment programs. So the panel expressed some very deep skepticism that the singular goal of completely removing Iran's nukes is anywhere near actual completion. And hey, let's say the strategy works absolutely perfectly today and hostilities completely stop. The panel brought in analysis from energy experts like Sonny Remco, who noted that relief won't be immediate anyway. It literally takes months for these changes to cycle through the complex global system. In fact, their timeline suggests gas prices wouldn't truly normalize until 2027. So that political promise of immediate economic relief, it just doesn't align with the market realities. Which brings us to our final section, China's geopolitical long game, assessing U.S. weakness. Think about it. If the U.S. is going to China from a position of need, how is Beijing assessing this whole situation? They're incredibly keenly aware of leverage. The panel pointed out that China knows they are negotiating with a president who is currently facing weak approval ratings, hovering right around 30 to 35% according to their data. Furthermore, they're negotiating with a party that is widely seen as being in real danger of losing its congressional majorities. Beijing sees a leader walking into the room holding a very, very weak domestic hand. The panel contrasted the two political systems perfectly to explain China's massive advantage here. The U.S. is bound by short-term cycles. The administration is looking at roughly 170 days to an election and feeling immediate, intense political pain from those gas prices. China, on the other hand, they do not have immediate democratic elections as we know them. They can afford to absorb short-term friction. They have the ultimate luxury of playing the long game and simply waiting the U.S. out. And that led the MS Now panel to a deeply sobering conclusion regarding China's true motivations. The analysts argue that Beijing actually prefers the current dynamic. As the quote from the panel states, they see what Donald Trump is doing to this country, and they see that as furthering the end that they want, which is a decline in us as a superpower. The panel's assessment is basically that the domestic division and dysfunction in the U.S. are viewed by China as strategic assets in their own long-term quest for global dominance. So we are left wrestling with a pretty massive question. In the geopolitical long game, does domestic division ultimately cost a nation more than higher gas prices? The panel's analysis really shows us that an isolated foreign policy goal doesn't just empty our wallets at the grocery store. It fundamentally alters our leverage with the world's most powerful rivals. It is a heavy thought, for sure, but an absolutely essential one if we want to understand how the modern world actually works. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and always keep looking at the bigger picture.